Picture a dimly lit room in Vienna's Hofburg Palace, the air thick with the scent of incense and anxiety. On a lavish bed, beneath heavy velvet, a young woman is fading away, her body exhausted by endless dynastic duty. She is only 21, but a century of weariness is frozen in her eyes, the result of 6 pregnancies in 6 short years of marriage. But wait, let's pause this somber scene and rewind. Recall the sun-drenched halls of Madrid's Alcazar, where the great Velázquez is painting his masterpiece. At the center of the canvas is a radiant girl with hair the color of liquid gold, a symbol of hope and purity for a great empire. This is her, the Infanta Margarita Teresa. How did this angel from the canvas transform into a tormented shadow, and what terrible secret connects her fate to the fall of Europe's most powerful dynasty? This story is not just another biography of a forgotten princess. This is the chronicle of a great crime committed in the name of purity of blood and limitless power. It is the record of a genetic curse that the Habsburgs concealed behind the gilded walls of their throne rooms and the silk curtains of their bedchambers. Together, we will look behind the scenes of royal life, where love was merely a currency and a child's cradle was the first step onto a dynastic altar. Did you think you knew the story of the Infanta from the painting Las Meninas? You only know its glossy cover. Prepare yourself, for we are about to tell the truth of how a family, obsessed with the idea of world domination, knowingly sacrificed its most precious treasure, and why that sacrifice, in the end, was all for nothing. To understand how the angel from Velázquez's painting ended up on a sacrificial altar, one must first understand her family. The Habsburg dynasty was not merely a ruling house. It was a closed, self-sufficient ecosystem of power, hermetically sealed from the outside world. Their philosophy was terrifyingly simple. Everything must remain within. The lands, the crowns, the titles, and most importantly, the blood. They believed their famous blue blood, their sangre azul, was a divine gift that could not be diluted by unions with other lesser families. And to preserve this supposed purity, they chose the most dangerous and destructive path: systematic marriage between their closest relatives. Uncles wed their nieces, and first cousins exchanged vows at the altar, creating a family tree that looked less like a branching oak and more like a closed loop or a deadly noose. You must understand, for them, this was not something out of the ordinary. This was cold, calculated policy, the only viable strategy for survival in a world where every neighboring monarch dreamed of tearing off a piece of their vast empire. It was into this very system, into this world where lineage was valued more than human life, that Margarita Teresa was born in 1651. Her arrival was not a miracle of love, but the result of yet another dynastic contract. Her father was King Philip IV, an aging monarch already weary from the burdens of rule. Her mother was his own niece, the young Mariana of Austria, a girl brought to Spain as a guarantee of the alliance between the two branches of the very same family. The atmosphere at the Madrid court in those years was steeped in desperation. Philip's first wife and their only male heir had both died, leaving the future of the Spanish crown hanging by a thread. The birth of a healthy child from this new marriage became a fixation, a national imperative. And when, after several failed pregnancies, a strong and beautiful baby girl was born, the court breathed a sigh of relief. Margarita was not just a daughter. She was an asset, a guarantee, a golden chip in the great European game. Her value was magnified by the contrast with her younger brother Charles, whose fragile body was from birth a living map of the genetic errors accumulated over generations. The future King Charles II was so weak and infirm that his every breath seemed a miracle to the court. Against the backdrop of this sickly boy, this living reproach to the entire Habsburg system, the healthy and blooming Margarita shone like a priceless diamond. She was their plan B, their insurance policy, and their greatest hope for the continuation of the line. Her aging father, Philip IV, adored her, calling her nothing less than mi alegría, my joy. And there was no pretense in this. He genuinely loved his daughter, but this love was inseparable from the cold calculation of a monarch. In her rosy cheeks and clear eyes, he saw not just the features of a beloved child, but the future of his empire. He looked at her and saw the salvation of his dynasty, the guarantee that the crown of Spain would not fall into foreign hands. Thus, from her very first day, Margarita's life was not her own. She was born with a clearly defined mission: to be a pawn, to seal another alliance, and to produce new heirs for the great house of Habsburg. Her childhood was like a precious tapestry, woven from the golden threads of protocol and the silken threads of hope. It was spent within the walls of Madrid's royal palace, the Alcazar, a grand and somber labyrinth of hundreds of rooms, galleries, and secret corridors. For the little Infanta, this was not a fortress, but a cage of pure gold, to be sure, lined with Persian rugs and adorned with masterpieces by Titian and Rubens. Here, her every step, every breath, and every word were governed not by childish whims, but by a strict, almost liturgical etiquette. She had dozens of servants, ladies-in-waiting, and tutors, but she lacked the one thing that mattered most: the freedom to simply be a child. Her world was a world of adults, where games were rehearsals for future court ceremonies and fairy tales were replaced by lessons in genealogy and dynastic history. She was the most protected treasure in all of Spain, and this protection was indistinguishable from imprisonment. The Infanta's education was not a means of discovering the world, but a process of polishing the most expensive diamond in the crown. She was taught languages not to read poets in the original, but so she could hold polite conversation with foreign ambassadors and, most importantly, with her future husband. She studied music and dance not for her own pleasure, but to shine at court balls, demonstrating the grace and perfection of the Habsburg breed. The fundamentals of religion and Latin were meant to instill in her a submission to the will of God and her father. Every lesson was another thread tightening the knot of her predestination. She was not a person, but a project. She was being prepared for the only role for which she was born: the future empress, and more importantly, the mother of heirs. Any display of a lively, restless character was gently but firmly suppressed. It was instilled in her that her body, her will, and her future belonged not to her, but to the great house of Habsburg. And then, when she turned 5, this project reached its first culmination. The court painter, Diego Velázquez, a genius of light and shadow, was commissioned to capture the Infanta for posterity. Thus was born the painting we know as Las Meninas, Let us step into the artist's spacious, light-filled studio. At the center stands a little girl in a voluminous silver dress like a porcelain doll. Around her bustle ladies-in-waiting and dwarves. A large mastiff sleeps on the floor, all creating the illusion of a lively, casual domestic scene. But it is only an illusion, a brilliantly staged performance. Look closer. In a mirror on the far wall, the dim figures of her parents, the king and queen, are reflected. They are the unseen directors of this play, observing their greatest investment. And Margarita herself, with her serious, unchildlike gaze, is not merely the subject of the painting. She is its sacred center, the living embodiment of stability and hope for the dynasty's future. Velázquez did not paint a portrait of a child. He created a political manifesto, an icon designed to convince the world that the House of Habsburg was strong and unbreakable, its future as bright as the face of this blonde-haired girl. But behind this radiant facade lay a terrifying truth, one that not even the genius of Velázquez could hide. The dynasty was slowly devouring itself from within. Centuries of inbreeding had turned their bloodline into a genetic dead end. Each new generation inherited not only crowns and lands, but a host of physical and mental afflictions. The famous Habsburg jaw, a massive chin and protruding lower jaw, was merely the most harmless external sign of this degeneration. Far more terrifying were the epilepsy, infertility, and intellectual disabilities that plagued the family, one member after another. Margarita, by a stroke of luck, or as it would later turn out, a fatal twist of fate, seemed almost untouched by this family curse. Her features were delicate, her mind sharp, and it was this apparent health that made her the ultimate stake in the dynastic game. She was the pure vessel, meant to renew and save the fading blood of the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. Her beautiful, childish face in the painting was not just a symbol of hope. It was her sentence. She was too valuable, too perfect to be allowed to live a life of her own. Her path was charted long before she was born, and the golden frames of the paintings in the Alcazar were but a prelude to the gilded cage where she was destined to spend the rest of her days. Childhood, no matter how regimented, ended abruptly and irrevocably. When Margarita was 12, ambassadors arrived from Vienna with the official proposal everyone had been anticipating. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, her maternal uncle and paternal first cousin, asked for her hand in marriage. This union was the cornerstone of all Habsburg European policy. It was meant to permanently fuse the Spanish and Austrian branches of the dynasty, creating an unbreakable Catholic monolith capable of withstanding any enemy. For a 12-year-old girl, this meant the end of everything she had ever known and loved. The negotiations, the arrangement of the dowry, the signing of the marriage contract, it all passed her by like a majestic but alien masquerade. Her opinion, of course, was never asked. She was not a bride, but the grand prize, a precious parcel being prepared for shipment to the distant cold city of Vienna. These agonizing preparations dragged on for 2 years. For 2 years, she lived with the knowledge that she would soon leave her native Spain forever. In the autumn of 1666, at the tender age of 14, the Infanta began her journey. It was not merely a trip, but a grand state operation. She was accompanied by a massive entourage of hundreds of courtiers, servants, and guards. The farewell to her father, King Philip, was heartbreaking. He was already gravely ill, and they both knew they were seeing each other for the last time. She was leaving behind not only her family, but also the warm climate of Madrid, the sounds of her native language, the familiar food, the entire small world that constituted her life. The journey across Europe took several months and became a true ordeal for the young girl. But at last, the spires of Vienna appeared on the snowy horizon. Her arrival in the imperial capital was staged with unimaginable, deafening pomp. Emperor Leopold, her fiancé and uncle, spared no expense. The city thundered with salutes. Free feasts were held in the streets, and in the palace one lavish ball followed another. The celebrations culminated in the premiere of the opera Il Pomodoro, the Golden Apple, composed especially for their wedding. This performance, lasting 2 days, went down in history as one of the most magnificent and costly spectacles of the Baroque era. But all this gilded veneer could not hide the central drama. Margarita, now the Empress, felt alien and lost in this new world. The Viennese court was strikingly different from the strict, almost monastic order of Madrid's Alcazar. Here, the atmosphere was freer, noisier, and more boisterous. To her, the Austrian aristocracy seemed coarse and unrefined. The German language grated on her ears, and the local cuisine was repulsive. She clung desperately to her Spanish habits as if to a life raft. She surrounded herself exclusively with Spanish ladies-in-waiting, continued to wear the severe Spanish dresses that were considered old-fashioned in Vienna, and stubbornly refused to learn German. This small, self-contained Spanish island in the midst of the Austrian court provoked muted irritation and ridicule. She was seen as an arrogant, capricious, and haughty Spaniard, unwilling to embrace the culture of her new homeland. The marriage to Leopold itself was also complex and contradictory. The emperor was 11 years older than his young niece-wife. He was an educated man, a passionate lover of music and hunting, but he was also utterly unattractive, even by the standards of the Habsburgs with their family jaw. Historians suggest their relationship was more warm than passionate. He seems to have grown genuinely fond of his young wife, calling her by the Austrian diminutive Gretel and indulging many of her whims. She, however, addressed him only as uncle, a fact that spoke volumes about the nature of their union. This was not a marriage of two people in love, but an alliance of two state symbols, the fulfillment of a dynastic contract. For Margarita, he never became a confidant, remaining a representative of that alien, incomprehensible force that had torn her from her home and cast her to the far edge of Europe. Her heart remained in Spain with her father and her little brother. She wrote letters to Madrid filled with anguish, complaining of loneliness and the cold. She was the empress on the throne of one of the world's greatest powers. But in her soul, she remained just a frightened, lonely girl, sacrificed to the high stakes of politics. And her greatest ordeal was yet to come. As soon as the last of the wedding fanfares faded, a new and darkest chapter began for the young empress. Her primary mission, the very reason she had been brought to Vienna, was brutally clear. She had to give birth. She had to produce heirs, sons who would guarantee the future of the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. And Margarita, with the resignation of the doomed, began to fulfill her duty. She was barely 16 when she became pregnant for the first time. From that moment, her body was turned into a production line, working to the point of collapse in the name of dynastic interests. Her life became an endless, grueling cycle, a pregnancy, a difficult birth, a brief respite, and then pregnancy again. In 6 years of marriage, she went through this 6 times. Can you imagine what this means for the body of a young girl, herself not yet fully grown? It was a slow, methodical destruction. Each new pregnancy sapped her strength, eroding the already fragile health she had inherited from her ancestors. But the physical torment was only part of her tragedy. Far worse was the agony of her soul. Of the 6 children she brought into the world, only one daughter, Maria Antonia, survived. The others died in infancy or were stillborn. Her first, long-awaited son, Ferdinand Wenzel, lived for little more than a year, leaving behind nothing but a gaping void in his mother's heart and a state of panic at court. For Margarita, every such loss was not merely a personal grief, but another failure of her mission. She saw the disappointment in the eyes of the courtiers. She heard their whispers behind her back. Her inability to produce a healthy heir was perceived not as a misfortune, but as her fault, her failure as an empress. The court physicians, with their primitive methods of treatment based on bloodletting and dubious potions, only aggravated her suffering. They noted in their reports her constant pallor, weakness, and melancholy. She grew ever more withdrawn, appearing less and less in public, spending her days in the gloom of her chambers behind heavy curtains, alone with her pain and her fear. In this endless cycle of physical and mental torment, Margarita desperately searched for a reason for her misfortune. Her mind, raised in an atmosphere of deep, almost fanatical religiosity, could find only one explanation. This was the wrath of God. She was convinced that God was punishing her and her family for some terrible sin. But what sin? In her search for an answer, she sank deeper into a mire of religious mysticism, surrounding herself with priests and monks. And at some point, under the influence of her confessors, she found her culprits. Her anger and despair crashed down upon the Jewish community of Vienna. In those times, anti-Semitism was a powerful and widespread ideology, and the idea that non-believers could be the cause of all woes seemed logical to many. Margarita came to believe that the presence of Jews in the capital desecrated Christian land and brought divine wrath upon her family. She began to exert colossal pressure on her husband, Emperor Leopold. She begged, demanded, and implored him to expel the Jews from Vienna, presenting it as the only means of salvation. Leopold, who was initially skeptical of the idea, the Jewish community was an important source of revenue for the treasury, eventually yielded to the pressure from his wife and her spiritual advisors. In 1670, a decree was issued for the expulsion of all Jews from the city. Their homes and property were confiscated, and the main synagogue was demolished, with a Catholic church erected in its place. Margarita likely felt a grim satisfaction at that moment. She had done what she considered a godly deed, made a sacrifice of sorts to appease the heavens. But the heavens remained deaf to her pleas. This cruel and senseless act brought her no relief. Her children continued to die, and her own health deteriorated with each passing day. She was trapped, Her body was betraying her, her faith offered no comfort, and the world around her had shrunk to the size of her bedchamber, where she once again prepared for motherhood, dreading what the outcome would be. The year was 1673. The exhausted, tormented body of the 21-year-old empress was once again carrying a new life. But this time, the fragile vessel, which had been filled to the brim so many times, finally cracked. This last pregnancy was a burden too great for Margarita to bear. Her body, turned into a battlefield for the survival of the dynasty, finally refused to serve. She barely left her bed, her strength fading each day like spring snow under the cold Viennese sun. The doctors were powerless, and prayers no longer offered solace. Everyone at court understood they were witnessing the final acts of a prolonged tragedy. In March of 1673, her earthly journey came to an end. The angel from Velázquez's painting, unable to deliver her child, faded away in her chambers, forever laid to rest in a land that had always been cold and foreign to her. Emperor Leopold, her uncle and husband, was inconsolable. Contemporaries noted that he mourned his Gretel with sincere and profound grief. Perhaps, in that cold dynastic union, there had been a spark of human affection after all. He secluded himself in his chambers for a long time and was even said to have cut off his long hair as a sign of mourning. But the personal grief of a monarch is nothing against the ruthless logic of power. The empire needed an heir, and it needed one urgently. The dynastic machine could not stand idle for sentimentality. Less than a year later, Leopold married again to a new princess, who was expected to perform the very same function, to bear sons. Margarita's place at the throne and in the imperial bedchamber was quickly filled, and her short, suffering-filled life began to fade into a line in the history books. She had done her duty and was written off. But was her sacrifice even worth it? Did it give the dynasty the life-saving impulse everyone had hoped for? For a fleeting moment, it might have seemed so. Her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, became a most valuable asset in the next round of the dynastic game. She was married off to the Elector of Bavaria and soon gave birth to a son, Joseph Ferdinand. This boy, Margarita's grandson, became the primary claimant to the Spanish throne should her brother Charles fail to produce an heir. It seemed this was the fruit of her suffering, the hope for salvation. But the fate that loomed over the Habsburgs merely scoffed at these hopes. At the age of 6, the little prince died suddenly, taking with him the last illusion of a peaceful future. And then, the final figure in this drama took the stage. Margarita's brother, King Charles II of Spain, known to his people as the Bewitched. He was the living embodiment of all his family's genetic errors, a walking encyclopedia of degeneration. His sickly, sterile reign was the long death agony of the Spanish Habsburgs. When he finally left this world in 1700 without an heir, the very thing his ancestors had so feared and so desperately tried to prevent came to pass. The grand dream of eternal power, for which the lives and fates of women like Margarita had been sacrificed, crumbled to dust. Europe was plunged into the flames of the War of the Spanish Succession, a bloody conflict that forever changed the political map of the continent. The Infanta's sacrifice, her broken childhood, her tormented body, and her unfulfilled hopes, proved to be not just tragic. They were utterly and devastatingly pointless. The system she served had consumed her, only to collapse anyway. Today, in the brightly lit halls of the Prado Museum in Madrid, a crowd always stands before one of the greatest canvases in human history. Thousands of tourists from all over the world gaze in admiration at Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas. Their eyes are fixed on the central figure, a small, fair-haired girl in a magnificent dress who looks out at the viewer with a serious, unchildlike dignity. They see a masterpiece of composition and light. They marvel at the genius of an artist who captured a fleeting moment of courtly life. But they do not see the tragedy. They admire the image, but they do not know the terrible price that was paid for it. To them, she is just an Infanta, a nameless character from a distant past. Art granted Margarita Teresa immortality, but this immortality turned out to be a cruel joke. It forever trapped her in the image of a 5-year-old girl frozen in time, turning her into an eternal symbol of purity and unfulfilled hope. Behind every stroke of the master's brush lies the real story, a story of duty, loneliness, pain, and ultimately of a meaningless sacrifice. Looking at this canvas, we must remember that we are seeing not just a portrait. We are seeing the prologue to a great drama, the first act of a tragedy whose finale was written long before its heroine was even born. Her short life is not just one of many chapters in the history of the House of Habsburg. It is a timeless, piercing reminder that behind the dazzling gleam of crowns and the icy majesty of empires, there are always real human lives. Margarita's story teaches us to look deeper, beyond the glossy facade of art and official chronicles, to see the real people within, with their fears, their suffering, and their losses. She was born to be the guarantee of her dynasty's eternal power. But the dynasty fell, and the empire she served so faithfully took everything from her: her childhood, her health, her hope, and finally, her very life.